very warm welcome to the 2023 series of the Terra Researchers webinar. I'm Piyinwa. I am one of the organizers of the series. Amongst other things, I am also a PhD student on the eResearch and Tell program at Lancaster, where this webinar series were originally born from, and I'm also a digital learning producer at a university in the UK and many other things which I'm not going to bore you about because it's not about me. Today I'm joined by my fabulous psychic John. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name's John Brindle. I am also a PhD student on the eResearch and Tell program at Lancaster, cohort 14, the best cohort in my opinion.
I was going to say that.
And I am Learning Design Manager at Edge Hill University in Ormskirk in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. Now, before I introduce to you our guest today, I just wanted to quickly mention that for those of you who have attended our sessions last year, you might have noticed we'll change our name slightly from Terra Researchers at Lancaster to just using a hashtag Terra Researchers. That is simply because we wanted to reflect a wider reach to both our speakers and our audience from around the world. We're really excited this year. We've got speakers from the UK, from the US, Australia, Canada, etc., etc. But we haven't forgotten about Lancaster, which is always going to be in our hearts. It goes without saying. So the ethos of the series remains exactly the same. We invite Terra researchers, HE researchers to talk about their practice, their stories, their successes, just about themselves. So the series isn't about a particular research study or a particular set of outcomes. Is really about the people behind the papers you might have read or behind a webinar or a seminar you might have attended. So really it's about the people. I am so honored today to introduce to you two fabulous human beings, two people who I'm so privileged to be able to call my friends and to reach out to for advice and opinions in the last few years, something that I'm always going to be grateful. So first of all, we have Dr. Donna Lanclos, who is a freelance consulting anthropologist. And then we have Professor Lawrie Phipps, who is a researcher, facilitator, and organizational consultant. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand everything that they do because they wear many, many hats separately and together. But I think one of the common threads about all that they have done, all that they do, is their human-centric approach in digital spaces, digital education, and leadership. So I'll let them tell you more about that because, you know, I'm going to start digging a hole and sort of very quickly fall into that if I don't shut up very quickly. I'd like to end my introduction to Donna and Larwie by paraphrasing something they have said in an interview last year, which they're going to laugh because I've said it a couple of times publicly. That is, digital transformation is about people, culture, and resources, because EdTech will not save you. I'll go as far as say that whilst EdTech won't save you, if you listen to Donna and Larwie, they might just save you. With that note, I'm going to hand over to the fabulous duo.
Brian, thank you. We will also not save you.
You might.
No, we're gonna get that right out there. Thank you so much. Yeah, so Lawrie and I thought, since this is meant to be a conversation about research and research approaches and just sort of getting a sense of how we came to the practices that we did, that we would try to interview each other about how we got here. I think that one of the things that can be missing, I think less so now than when I started out, but one of the things that can be missing from an idea of what research looks like is the idea that the researchers you see around you didn't start off where they are now, that there's always a journey and a process, and that the things that happened make a lot more sense in hindsight than they do when they're happening to you.
I think one of the things is just looking at the screen now, and I recognize at least half of the people that are on the screen, that I know that they've also been through several incarnations of who they are anyway. So that whole process of, we're living in a time of change in our institutions, and most of the people that we work with are changing as we go through those times as well, with what they do and how they do it. And so that whole thing about how we got here is a really important narrative that we have to capture, because it also tells us the history of what's happening in our institutions.
Yeah, and I know I was taught in my education by professors who did not have a terrifically complicated path to where they were. So one of my struggles as a researcher early on was contrasting the sort of weird patchwork of stuff I was doing with what my professors did. My advising professor, Alan Dundees, was a folklorist. He did his undergraduate degree at Yale, which was a big deal at the time because he was also a Jewish man, and he was one of the first Jewish men to be admitted to Yale back in the 50s. He wore a Yale pin on his suit every time I saw him. And I felt like that was a real, he didn't flip people off. He wasn't that kind of person, but I felt like it was a real middle finger to Yale that he was like, I was in there. He did his PhD at Indiana and then arrived at UC Berkeley and was there for the rest of his life, starting from the 60s until the early 2000s. And so, and all of my professors were like that. They got to a place and they were there for a very long time. And that is not what has happened to me. Even though I started off doing a PhD in anthropology at UC Berkeley, I was very quickly unemployed and then part-time employed. And I didn't start having a full-time research anything until 10 years after I got my degree. Lawrie, what did it look like for you? What's the difference between the people who educated you for your degree and what you're doing now?
So I think one of the things is I guess that I didn't start out wanting to be a researcher. And I also, what Puyin missed from the beginning is that my job is I'm the senior research lead at JISC. So I work for JISC, as many of you all know, and I do teaching elsewhere. And my prof is at Kiel, and both Donna and I are working with Virginia Tech. So it's a sort of portfolio of things that we do, and that's kind of how research happened for me as well. I left university. I was a mature student, so I had a whole thing going on before I actually went to university. And then for those of you that remember the 1980s, and looking at this audience, I think that's a lot of you, then, you know, it was a really interesting time under Thatcher when there was actually very little things going on. And so I left one career just after the 80s and decided to go into education. And I fully intended to leave university with my degree and go off and do something completely different. For those of you that know, Paul Bailey is responsible for me working in education now, literally by me just walking through the campus and him stopping me and having a chat. So that's how I came to be here. I don't know when it happened, when I transitioned and started doing research. I genuinely couldn't sort of put my finger on that point. I guess it's just something that's happened more and more.
Sorry, I was trying to put something clever in the chat. Somebody called out Thatcher the milk snatcher, and I'm saying our version of that was Reagan defining ketchup as a vegetable.
Yeah.
Similar assaults on school children. So I was raised as an academic to be a researcher. My undergraduate degree was also in anthropology. Everything was oriented to producing a tiny baby researcher. I went to do my graduate degree right after I did my undergraduate degree, and was, again, like, it was assumed that I would then go on and be a professor who did research. And I was surrounded by people who shared that same assumption. And it was a time in the 90s, and I'm sure this is a narrative that lots of people have heard about other careers. All the senior people in the field are going to be retiring. Stop me if you've heard this one. All the senior people in the field are going to be retiring, and then you can get their jobs, and then it will be, you know, and then we will just reproduce this thing. Well, of course, that didn't happen. First of all, none of them have retired. 2/3 of my graduate committee died before they retired. So this is how committed to not retiring baby boomers in the US are. And then when people did retire or leave otherwise, those positions were either not filled or they were filled by, again, stop me if you've heard this, part-time lecturers who are a lot cheaper. So I emerged from my graduate degree at a time where full-time study employment in academia was already starting to decline quite rapidly. Not because the teaching didn't need to happen, but because universities were not hiring in the same way that they did in the 70s and even in the 80s.
And at the time I graduated, we were just starting to come into that big change in education. I graduated just before Blair, and then we started getting fees. And all of a sudden, things like PhDs became harder to get onto, whereas the sort of generation that I worked with at university, they seemed to sort of just say, oh, well, there's lots of places you can go and do PhDs, and it's really easy to go and do this, and there's lots of opportunities. Just as I was graduating, it felt like there were so few of them around, and it just started becoming more precarious, with people working and studying, and then, to get a PhD, people were working. One of the people that I knew as after I graduated, she was working in Tesco's whilst doing a PhD full time at the university, because that's just the way it went very quickly, I think, in the 90s.
So can you think, Lawrie, of what you think your first research project actually was?
Action research projects. I was looking very early on at how we might. So I was doing projects that were development projects. Let's be honest about that. My first work was working on virtual field work, and I was building things for undergraduates to actually do virtual field work as preparation before they went into the field. I think when it crossed over into research is when I started trying to understand how they use the tools, what motivated them to use the tools, and what the impact of those tools were when they were in the field. What I didn't realize at the time was that was my gateway into educational research. And those of you probably know Paul Bailey and Helen Beetham, Rona Sharp. Those were my mentors in those early days of me doing that research.
Wait, you have qualified that as educational research, but didn't you do research when you were doing your environmental science degree?
So in my environmental science degree, the research that I was doing on my honors project and the work that I was doing for that did actually contribute to a couple of papers that were published, and so I got sort of cited on those. But it was closely supervised, but it gave me a very STEM approach as well, and it was very quant based. It was very quantitative. So
what was it? What was the research?
I was measuring sewage outfall.
From where?
A place called Slapton Lee in Devon. I was looking at the amount of sewage coming in at one end of a reed bed and the amount of sewage leaving the other end of the reed bed. And
what did you find?
That there wasn't that much difference, and that the reed bed wasn't actually making that much difference to the research. It involved me going in a big. It's quite nice when you used to walk across the beach, and I would have my big plastic coveralls on and be wearing a face mask, and I'd be sampling through the reed bed, and then I'd walk out into the sea where the outfall was, where all the bathers were, and start collecting samples very carefully and putting them in test tubes, with all of the bathers staring at me going, why is he in that suit? What's going on? Well, it's amazing how many people left the water.
Yeah, you'd think. Okay,
Yeah.
so you were saying though there wasn't, so the reed bed was not mitigating anything, right? So all of this stuff about
very little. It did do a little bit. It actually reduced the number of particulates.
Okay.
The lumps, as it were.
That's not reassuring.
Yeah. So a lot of the lumps were being caught in the reed bed, but very little else. So yeah, but that was my introduction to sort of research, as it were. But then I was doing the research on how people were using EdTech. So I sort of started off. I didn't even know that EdTech was a thing. That's how I started, doing those things.
So what is the difference in terms of even how you need to think between the kind of measure this, quantify that science that you were doing around reed beds and the human stuff. I love Puyin. So you went from, effluent measuring to a different kind of effluent, if we
So again, I didn't know that I was going to say groomed then. That's probably not the right word.
do not say that. No.
Rona Sharp, my office was 2 floors up from Rona Sharp, who, as many people know, is head of academic development at Oxford now. And she used to do these seminars about how we measured student learning, or what we did at, how we sort of worked to understand the student experience better. And I used to go along to the lunchtime sessions. And then they started saying, oh, well, you should do this in your project, or you should do that in your project. And I was doing, I learned what ethnography was and things like that, and started applying it to my projects. And so it was almost like somebody was sort of saying, I know you're doing all of this learning technology work, and you're doing this to sort of service the academics who are teaching, and you're providing these materials. How you make it better is by doing this kind of research on it. And I don't even think they used the word research. They just said, find out what works and what doesn't. And all of a sudden, I realized that I was actually doing more and more of the what works and what doesn't than I was actually using things like HTML. And we used to use things like front page back then to generate websites. Or there's there's a guy called Paul Bailey built a thing called Bahari Farmer in a visual toolkit, and we used to use things like that. But I was much more interested even back then at finding out what worked and what didn't. So that's how I sort of got into the EdTech, and how I guess, I started to get more and more interested in what works and what the research is around EdTech, and it sort of built on that. But you didn't have that grounding though. So where did your grounding come from?
So I was just thinking, one of the things that I teach now is methods. So I run seminars on ethnographic methods. I do workshops on particular methods like interviews and how do you analyze this data. The entire time I was doing my doctoral degree, I did not get methods training. So I was doing an anthropology PhD at a time in the US when a lot of the professors mystified the process of ethnographic research to a degree where they found it almost offensive if you suggested that you could use some tips about how to actually gather data once you were in the field. In the field was this sort of, wild and wonderful place where you would just go and you would figure it out. The phrase "you will figure it out" was said to me a lot of times when I was doing my graduate degree. And it felt almost like an anathema to some professors that they would actually describe what they did. And so I was having to go to readings written by other people at other institutions about this is what it looks like. My saving grace as a student was that I was also studying folklore, and folkloristics gave me a methodological handle to hold on to. I could gather, I was doing fieldwork in Northern Ireland. I was in Belfast in the late 90s, and I was doing research with primary school children. And the methodological hook that I had was folkloristics. I will collect the things that they are doing on the playground, and then I will have a data set, and then in and around all of the other stuff I do, the sort of deep hanging out, to quote Renata Rosaldo, one of the anthropologists in a previous generation, I will be able to have this sort of, rich textured thing that I can describe that's going on in the children's lives. Because one thing that you cannot do as a grown person is just hang out in a neighborhood with kids, right? That's not something that you get to do. So I had to have this fairly strictly controlled environment where it was safe for the children and it was safe for me to interact with them. So for folklore and engaging with them in terms of games and listening to their jokes was also a way for me to just have a real conversation with them, because you can't walk up to an 8-year-old and say, so tell me about your life here in Belfast. That's not gonna fly. But all of my methods training and all of my methods knowledge has happened after the PhD, basically. They threw us in and saw if we could swim, and then that was the end of it. So me as a methodologist is way post my formal training as an anthropologist. And part of what made me have to become a methodologist was moving into applied anthropology, working in academic libraries, which I didn't start doing until 2009. So again, like 10 years after I got my PhD, I started doing applied work in academia and libraries. And part of what made me a methodologist was having to explain to non-anthropologists how and why I know things. How the notion that in library science and information science in particular, they are also very sort of quantified, and we have this many things and we have this kind of frequency and we've got these sorts of use statistics, and those were signifiers of importance and meaning. And so I had to do teeny tiny seminars on the nature of anthropological research and give sort of little epistemological lectures on a regular basis when I was at work, because the idea that you could know things doing qualitative research was unfamiliar to a lot of the people that I was working with in libraries. So I was both doing research and having to justify the nature of my research at the same time. It was very, very tiring.
Yeah, we were more lucky doing the work that we were doing, having we had a really forward-thinking educational development unit that really supported people to sort of get involved and use that kind of qualitative methodologies, a range of things. And whilst we didn't use them, in great depth, there was such broad knowledge in that team. It's people like Hazel Fullerton and, like I say, Rona, Paul, Helen. They sort of had a range of different tools in their armory that we could just sort of deploy and use to find out what students were doing, which was really helpful. I actually felt really supported in that environment.
And that was which position? So you were doing what at that time?
I was a learning technologist building. Actually, we weren't even building software packages back then. We were just making better websites for students to use, which we thought was cutting edge at the time. I remember going on a course to learn how to use Flash. It was that simple. And all we were really trying to do is get a better understanding of how students were using. But even back then, I started to sort of question the quant thing, because I discovered I could get stats on how many times and when people were accessing the materials. And then I'd look at, we'd look at grades with some of the lecturers in the classes and go, oh, well, there was no difference. So, if they're using it, what's going on? And sort of realizing that we had to go into more depth and sort of understand how and why things were working and what things weren't working.
Yeah. And I remember having that conversation. I mean, so that was when,
That was in 1998, 99.
Okay. Yeah. So late 90s, those conversations are happening. And then in 2009, there are a lot of surveys flying around library land, in the same way that there are a lot of surveys flying around the education sector generally.
Right now.
Yes, no, people are over surveyed to an astonishing degree now, and that's not new. It just seems to be particularly acute. And the idea at the time was, we'll find out what people are doing, and they had all these questions like, do you have a Facebook account? Are you on, and they would be sort of yes or no questions. And then they would then have this lovely pie chart signaling statistically, what sort of accounts students had. And that was the end of it. They didn't know why they had those accounts. They didn't know and too often, some of my colleagues would say, a whole bunch of students are on Facebook. The library needs to have a Facebook account. But if you actually talk to students about what they were doing with Facebook, they would say things like, I have to be in Facebook because all of my relatives are in Facebook. And now that I'm here away from home, that's how I keep in touch with them. So it was a very different part of their lives that was in that particular kind of social media thing. The idea that a university would insert itself or attempt to insert itself into students' Facebook presence. I know it's different now, but back then there was a real divide between what was personal social media and what was institutional social media. And it felt sort of creepy and weird for us to assume that students would want us in their social media. This is the creepy treehouse thing that we've talked about in workshops before, right? The idea that you would just sort of be there and lurk in people's social media, whether they invited you there or not. Again, is something that I think people are.
But that's what anthropologists do, right?
Well, we are slightly creepy and weird.
And professionally stalk people.
So there are professional conversations about how you do that ethically, right? One of the things that I get to do in teaching methods is have conversations with colleagues about their own methodological approaches, as we're doing now. And one of my colleagues did his field work for a long time with one of the Pueblo nations in Texas. And when he was, again, a baby researcher and had, very particular ideas about what he wanted to do and the projects he had, he went to the tribal government and he said, I have this idea for this project that I'd like to do. And he, laid it all out for them. And they basically said, yeah, no, we're not interested in you doing that. And then he left because he didn't know what else to do. Went and did a different project unrelated to that. At some point later on, somebody who was affiliated with the tribal government got in touch with them and said, we have these things that we would like to have done. Would you like to come and help us with that? So he thought, oh, great, I'll do that. And so he went down and then described for the first several weeks the series of housekeeping tasks that he was asked to do. Clean out this closet. Could you help this person move these things from one place to the other? And he spent a significant chunk of time just proving that he was willing to be useful before he was allowed to do his research. So increasingly, anthropologists, particularly those of us who do applied work,
venue was two of England's biggest clubs clashed.
Need to demonstrate that we're willing to be useful over and above anything that we have around our research agendas generally. We need to be willing to be told by the people that we're learning from, this is actually the angle on the research that we would like you to take, rather than sort of bowling in and saying, hey, I've got this great idea. You all are going to help me figure this stuff out. And I think we tried to do that at least a little bit of back when I was embedded in an academic library, tried to get a sense from students about what was important to them, what were the things that they were concerned about. A lot of them were much more concerned than I think we anticipated at the time around feeling comfortable in spaces. There was a lot of skills-oriented anxiety coming from the library. Do students know how to do X? Do students know how to do Y? How can we get students to use the library website? How can we get them to engage with the search infrastructure that we have set up from the library? And there was a lot less questioning around, do students want to be here? How do these spaces feel for any given student? And I think we started to do more of that later on.
There's a trust issue.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's sort of, I think as you start doing this and you continue to do it, you realize how much the trust becomes important in the work that you do. That brings us, we'll go backwards and forwards, but at the moment, the work that I'm doing, as you know, I'm doing a composite narrative around voices of, I started by doing a composite narrative of student voices that are using what we're calling large language models or generative AI or the thing, whatever you want to call it. And I just started talking to students. I went through a process of, making sure that I was doing this ethically and everything else. And And eventually you start off by saying, well, I don't use it, and they use it a little bit, and I did a little bit of this on it. And eventually I'm starting to pick up through trust and through messaging and talking to the students just how much and how extensively they're using those tools as you build trust, and they start to realize that, you're not doing this to report them or things like that. And they start telling you all the things. And that trust and sort of building that into the sort of research process is really important. That I don't know what it's called, socialization. You become socialized. No,
it's not socialization.
Okay.
I think trust is a good way to talk about it. So even in my first experience with fieldwork, because the kids didn't know me from anybody, and because they were used to adults as authority figures instead of adults as just people hanging out on the playground, I had to spend, and I was doing research at 5 different school locations. So I had 5 different field sites where I had to normalize my presence such that they would do the things that they would have done even if I hadn't been there. I was always a little bit of a playground activity, but certainly the first few weeks that I was on a playground, talking to the new person was an activity. So I had to be there long enough to achieve being boring, basically boring enough so that they would go off and do the things that I really wanted to do. But I also had to spend some time establishing myself as a person who was not going to report them when they did naughty things. And I wrote a whole chapter about this, right? And this is them testing me with increasingly ruder and ruder rhymes, right? So there's a genre called choosing rhymes, where like before you do a game, you have to choose who's on it, right? And there's one, who's heard this? Ip, dip, dip. No, nobody? Ip, dip, dip. What comes next? John?
I remember it, but I can't remember what comes next.
Ip, dip, dip. My little ship sailed down the alleyway, and then it'll be either you are it or you aren't, so it depended, because you can extend it, right? If it's coming around to somebody that you don't want to be it, you can say you are not it, or my mother told me to pick this one. There's some social manipulation going on. So there are ruder versions of those. There are ones that involve the word shit, for instance. And so the first time they would let that fly, they would give a little look and see if I was going to stand up, or if I was going to scold them, or if I was going to report them. One of the activities was them running up to me and saying, Miss, because I was always Miss until I was Donna, I was Miss. Miss, he said a bad word. And I'd say, which one? And they would almost tell me, and then they would catch themselves and they'd give me a look. They'd be like, oh, you're trying to fool me. So that's the whole process, right? Of becoming somebody who's not going to report them, who's just going to listen or even participate, right? The moments where I could have a back and forth with them that involved being naughty was something that was really affirming in terms of our relationship and the things that I could learn from. The relationship of that kind of interaction to the work I did in the library was I had to establish myself as somebody who wasn't going to penalize students who talked to me about using Wikipedia or using Google Scholar or just straight up Google instead of the library websites. They had to first figure out that I wasn't looking for the right answer. I just wanted to know what they were doing. And that takes time.
And that's where I am now with the students that I'm talking to about the large language models. They're talking so it was earlier this week, and one of them said to me, I have a friend who might have used the large language model to rewrite parts of an essay that they got from an essay mill.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay. And we had a bit of a chat about it. And it was only, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that what he just came straight out and said, so I got this essay mill, and what I did is I actually took it and I put it through this, and this is how I did it, and this is what I did with the, and so it's they sort of, you know, they've got to know that you're not looking to penalize them, you're just trying to understand. But yeah, so that's really important. I think that sort of, that trust element, if you want to find out what's going on, you've got to sort of have that trust, haven't you?
Yeah, and we had that phenomenon. I mean, I think anybody who's done this kind of research can think of this moment where people started telling them what was really happening. Yeah, and then you have to almost go back to the beginning of the relationship and say, okay, so when you told me about this and this and this, and then say, yeah, here's what was really going on, right? So
yeah,
you can see this moment where they no longer saw you as a potential threat. They no longer saw you as somebody who was going to come down on them and report them. And the fact is that a lot of people in universities are never going to be those trusted people. People who are on instruction teams and libraries are almost always going to be perceived as people who want the correct answer when asked, what do you do for your research? Because there's a power differential there. If you are in a position of giving your students marks, then the extent to which they feel they can be candid with you about what they're actually doing is going to be limited. Now, sometimes they will tell you stuff regardless. But this is also true of the work that we've done with academic staff, right?
So that's where you and I started working together.
Yes.
And we started working with that. And I'm looking around the room, and again, I'm seeing people like Sue Buckingham's in the room, Nick Skelton's in the room. Those two examples straight away are people that go into other people's institutions and they get told more truth by those people in those institutions than perhaps they do in their own institutions or where they're working, because it's easier to talk to somebody who's from away than somebody who is really close to you that you see every day.
Yeah, and that's the utility. That's the utility of being an outside researcher. Like, one of the struggles being somebody who was embedded in the library at a time when I was trying to learn from students, I had to do all this song and dance around, yes, I work in the library and my job is to learn these things. And my ethics protocol that I had set up at the institution was very deliberate and specific about the ways that I position myself in relation to students. But I think that...
Did you still get people asking you to stamp their book?
No. I wasn't at a desk. Maybe if I'd been at a desk, those signifiers would have been there. But we spent a lot of time talking about, students talking about things that would be defined as misconduct, but members of academic staff talk about things and ways of approaching things that, may or may not be the way that they would talk about it when they're talking to their department chair, or when they're talking about, the ways that they think about preparing, teaching, or assessing students, or
and again, that's again the composite narrative. I've now moved over into talking to staff about how they're using tools. And again, it's taken a while, but I'm now getting honest answers from people who are using these tools to talk about. One particular academic told me how they've used it to apply for their fellowship for the academy, for example. And I think once you start to build those relationships and, people trust you, they'll tell you how they're really doing things.
So I think one of the things that's important to do is make a distinction between getting to a point where people will tell you what they're doing honestly and thinking that all the things they do are great.
Oh, I don't think all the things they do are great.
Yeah. So, but I think that that's something that's worth calling out, right? Like, not all the things that the kids did on the playground were great, right? Not all the things that I saw them do were things that I would have wanted, my children to do, or that I even wanted them to do to each other. But people are messy and they do things that are not great. But I think that if we want to learn from people's behavior, we need to be observing the actual behavior and not observing some performance of ideal stuff that they think we want to see.
Am I doing this right is something, that we've often when we've done, so we started doing research together in about 2015?
I think we were still mostly just doing workshop facilitation in 2015.
But when we started doing research, we started looking at educational practices. I think one of our first big pieces of research we did together was around teaching practices.
Yes.
And even though we were asking open questions of academic staff, they would still almost look at you and wonder whether or not, have I given you the right answer?
Yeah, there's a, is that what you're looking for moment.
Yeah. Or even sometimes somebody said there was one person, and I can't remember where they are, but they almost asked us, so is that good compared with the other people?
Yeah, they were trying to like benchmark it. And again, I think that those sorts of things also tell you the context, the other context in which people are asked about their practice, right? A lot of times people are not being asked about their practice in these sort of open-ended exploratory research things, but they're being asked about it as a form of assessment or in a professional development situation where there is a kind of a, oh, they're doing that, that's really good, maybe I should be doing that to get, you know, points or recognition or something like that. And I think this is an argument for, if you can, as researchers and as qualitative researchers, being able to go back over and over again, right? A lot of the projects that we have had to do recently have been kind of one-off. Let's recruit some people, let's talk to them, let's learn from what we heard, and then we kind of move on, right? We haven't had a chance, as I did when I was embedded in a library, you know, I was there for almost 10 years. And so every project that I did, large or small, was connected in some way with all of the other projects. So when I think about the arc of that work, it is a longitudinal project composed of much smaller ones. But some of the stuff that we've done, Lawrie, even though it's been connected by a methodology, right, where we've got similar interview instruments, we have a code book that we can now share across those projects because there's a lot of shared themes that are coming out of it. But we didn't get to go back and ask the same people follow-ups, right? We didn't get to build on those relationships. And I think it's when you get to build on those relationships, I mean, maybe we'll get a chance to at some point, but here we haven't done that yet.
Well, although some of the people that we worked with in those early ones are now people that are talking to me in my composite and narrative now. So some of those people I'm still working with, I had their teaching practice that they were doing now, and they're now telling me about ChatGPT. And through that process, the sort of, you know, I can see linkages back and forth as well. I think the longitudinal thing is really interesting in the context of EdTech researchers. I think that both you and I don't benefit from being in an institution where we can do that kind of longitudinal analysis, but it's so important to see those changes. I think I really would like to do that. I'm doing it a little bit now with Kiel, where I started off with the teaching practices in the pandemic. I've started doing assessment. I'm now looking at ChatGPT and assessment, and that's a sort of longitudinal thing that's sort of gone over the last 3 years. But really, for it to be really nice, it would be sort of 5 to 7 years.
And it's not until you're out of an institutional context that you realize what a luxury it is in some ways to be embedded in the institution, right? And so this is part of why I advocate for partnership with internal folks, right? Because then you get the benefit of, well, if I need to be a from away person, you've got that. But if you need somebody who's got the institutional knowledge and the networks within an institution, so you can have sort of the best of both worlds. And again, in anthropology, it's a really good idea to have more than one person on your research team. I know the stereotype of the academic anthropologist is that they go off into exotic lands all by themselves and come back and know all the things. But that sort of, you know, colonizer model of social anthropology is something that always had problems because you can't know all the things because you're a human instrument, right? And you don't have access to all the things. But it was always kind of a construction, right? Bronislaw Malinowski, who's often, pointed to as sort of the father, using that word advisedly, of a particular kind of anthropological fieldwork, that sort of long time away. The reason that he was in the Trobriand Islands for so long was because he was a prisoner of war during World War I. He was a Polish national. The British government didn't trust him, and they decided that he should just sort of stay in the Trobriands for 2 years rather than come back.
Well, that's probably a good thing, because if nowadays we'd have just sent him to Rwanda.
Well, I mean, there's a whole discussion to be had about the role of the British government and the formation of practices in social anthropology. We could talk about E. Evans Pritchard in the Sudan being hired by the British government to learn about the Azandi in the Sudan so as to better control them for the colonial government. So there's a long colonizing history in my discipline, and that desire for control is something that emerges even now. When I'm brought into certain situations, I will be asked things like, can you tell us what X group of people are doing around Y? Because we actually want them to be doing Z, right? So sometimes the agenda is, I want to understand what they're doing because I want to change their behavior. And that for me is the battle days, right?
So, well, there's that. There's another thing. I mean, and the people here that are interested in EdTech research, yeah, we're doing EdTech research. And to what extent is the research that we're doing and publishing in EdTech serving less academics and students and serving more vendors who want to understand more about what's going on so that they can actually build more stuff and sell more stuff?
Yes. Yeah. So to what extent is the research we're doing a kind of co-opted market research, as opposed to something that's actually generating insights into the human dimensions of this environment, right? This larger environment. So,
well, maybe, except that there are some ed techs that seek to control the behaviors of the students and the academics, and and to understand that so they can better control them we've got to be careful not to become E.E. Pritchard.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think that one of the ways you get away from that, I think one of the ways that you get away from becoming a tool of the man is to lean more into that sort of open-ended exploratory stuff that isn't A/B testing, that isn't, straight up UX, UI, does this interface work? Like, there is a role for that, right? If you built a tool and you want it to not suck, you need to do some, how does this look like when people are actually using it? To what extent are we avoiding once you learn to use it, it's very easy to use, which is something they heard a lot about library websites, which are never intuitively easy to use, but people who've been working in libraries for 30 years will say, oh yeah, that website, it's great. I know how to use it. So what I want people to do is to have as research questions, what does this look like, right? What does the research project look like when a student is doing it? What is the nature of information seeking when you're a first year student and you don't know your professors, right? What does that look like? And I've done projects like that, and to see the change from somebody who asks their friends and their roommates what they should do for their research paper in a first year context, because those are the people they know and trust, to being a third year who has a trusted relationship with their tutors.
Yep.
Asking the people who have the content knowledge that will really get them to that point. One of the things that I think is happening with the language learning models and ChatGPT and all of that is that the uptake is one part buying the hype, but it's also part genuinely struggling with, how do I reflect on my writing? How do I confront the blank page? how do I have conversations about the things that I should be producing? And I think it's a symptom of a kind of an isolation that isn't unique to this pandemic moment, but I think has been exaggerated by this pandemic moment. I think that I think it hit us at a really vulnerable time.
Yeah, I agree. And still hitting us at a vulnerable time.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we're never not vulnerable, right? I think there are things politically that have happened to the education sector that have made us more vulnerable to venture capital attempts to manipulate practice.
Yeah.
Right? The ways that predatory models of here's this thing that can tell you, or here's this thing that can harvest all of your students' essays, for instance, as is the case with Turnitin. And now here is this, revenue generating for the company model so that you can detect when your students are cheating, right? The whole student cheating industrial complex is born of manipulation of practice, right?
Yeah.
Coming from a place of fear and lack of control. And I wonder, not idly, I wonder every day what it would be like if we lived in a fully funded sector that didn't have to constantly scrap for a living wage, where you didn't have stuff closing instead of people being rehired for positions once somebody leaves. If there was any slack in the system at all, would these systems seem so attractive to people who are overworked and underpaid?
I'd settle for a sector where we actually had tomatoes.
I am sorry for your troubles.
I had tomatoes on toast for lunch and I felt really decadent.
Yes, you look at you with your tomatoes and your toast. It's going to be really hard for the students who want all of the on-campus catering to be vegan to locally source the stuff that they're going to want to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think.
Go.
Well, I was going to say, to that point, the research that we do doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? And the research questions that we have are motivated in part by our position in the sector, both as insiders and outsiders, but also the political environment in which the sector is operating, right? I think it's very difficult to disentangle those things. And too often, I think that institutional research offices want to pretend that these things are neutral, right? When they want to talk about things like student success or any of those things. I
mean, I've made a conscious decision not to be apolitical or to sort of pretend that, well, I'm going to ignore these elements, because none of I think the one thing about the fact that I did a STEM degree and I did quant and I'm an environmental scientist by background, moving into this space, is that actually the one thing that environmental science did give me that helps is that it's a holistic system. I learned about holistic systems because actually whatever you do in the environment has knock-on effects. What does a trophic cascade look like in an in a IT system? If Steve Rowett walks in one day and switches off one part of Moodle, what does that do to the student record system over in such and such? It's the same as in an environmental system, that holistic nature of things. And so you sort of widen that out. The students that I'm talking to are doing so. I'm talking to them at a time when they are working almost full-time jobs at the same time as trying to do a full-time degree. I did a whole load of research during lockdown on why Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, apologies for the phrase, global South students, or global majority students were doing better in lockdown in some institutions than they did out of lockdown. And, why was that? Well, some of the students were telling me that, well, I can't work, I actually have to study. So more global majority students were studying rather than working and studying and things like that. I'm not saying that, that might be correlation, but accepting that they don't study in isolation They
Yeah.
study and work, they study and commute, they study and look after their siblings, of which they've got a lot, or all of these things you have to sort of account for. And quite often, you know, certainly in the background that I had working, one of the jobs that I had afterwards, I was working in what was called the subject centers. And if I'd have said these things to some of the people that I worked with in those subject centers, you know, the people that I was going to say old white academics, but they were probably my age at the time, they would have just sort of discounted those sorts of elements and said, well, no, let's just look at what's happening in the lecture theatre. Let's just look at what's happening on the website. And actually, no, we have to look at the 2.5 hours it took for the student to drive to the campus before they went into the lecture. But I think that back in the 90s and maybe before that, we were doing less of that, more holistic. What is the political system? What is the social system? What is the cultural background that is happening? And
Yeah.
but now I really, you know, I really enjoy working out those things now with students. I really like understanding more about what their, you know, what their issues are. It
is astonishing to me. It shouldn't be, but it is astonishing to me the extent to which some folks think it's new to consider that not all students are first year full-time.
I know.
New students, right? The idea that all of the incoming students are 19-year-olds with no attachments hasn't been the case for a very long time.
Yeah.
And just now, some folks are saying, oh gosh, let's have official conversations about the diverse nature of the student body. I think that your post-92 institutions have a much better handle on this than your Russell Group institutions.
Well, I think that's probably a whole new argument that we can have. And I'm looking, there are people in this room. I'm not even sure that post-92 is a valid label anymore.
Well, so I'm trying to use that. So in the US, we have a much more porous higher and further education system than you do. We have 2-year community colleges where if you didn't finish high school, you can get a GED and go to a community college, and then you can transfer to a 4-year university, which might be a state university, which might be a large university, which might be a small university. There are a lot of different ways in. And so the university that I used to work at full-time, half of their incoming students in any given year were transfer students.
Right.
And transfer students tend to be students who are coming back into it, or who are older, or who have families and these sorts of things. This is the normal, right? It's not an exception. Francie, did you want to say something? Or are you just like, yay,
You're
yes?
just hitting all the spots. I'm at a state school, so half of our population is transferred.
Yes.
You're just basically outlining everything I live every day.
Yeah, and this isn't of course, right? So we shouldn't have to have special programs for, oh gosh, how do we deal with transfer students? This should be, how are we meeting the needs of our students? And if we assume that our students have complicated lives that don't revolve around the university all the time. I mean, one of the hardest things I had to do in the library was get my colleagues to imagine the student experience outside of the library so that they could effectively interpret what was erupting in library spaces, whether it's on the website or in the building. Like, you don't understand what's going on unless you zoom out, at least at a university level, and ideally at a city level. Do you live in a city that has public transportation? Your students are writing their papers on the train.
Yeah. Steve's just made it. I just want to go back to what Steve just said. We've got students that have graduated, graduates working at JISC now. So I've got a student who is working at JISC, and Steve just put in the chat, it's interesting that we still define a subset of universities by what they were 31 years ago. When we refer to post-92s, I was reflecting on this when we were doing our induction for the graduates that we've taken on at JISC. They didn't know what a post-92 meant.
Yeah.
because they're all 20 or
Right.
21. But it's this generational thing that we still, but I think there's part of that is in the research, we still reference this sort of thing in the research that we do, especially in educational research. We still create these artificial boundaries in the UK sometimes with that research as well.
I think there's work to be done around what impact those labels have as structures, right? What are the structures of government doing around those labels? And then what is the sort of grassroots understanding of what going to university is, right? And what are the options? And I think there's really interesting work to be done there. I think in the same way that London can suck all of the oxygen out of the room in discussing, what should we do around transportation in England, for instance.
Yeah.
Certain,
Transportation in England is not how you get from King's Cross to Waterloo, but
Right,
that
right.
seems to be the big conversation, or how you use Crossrail.
Yeah. So the Ivy Leagues in the US, in terms of the undergraduate experience, can suck all the oxygen out of the room when we have a conversation about the student experience. The popular understanding of what the student experience is persists in being this sort of Ivy League notion, even though the actual lived experience of students in the US is not that. It's a big old state school, or it's a community college, right? But we don't have those movies. Now we have Community, the TV show, which was fantastic. But I think that in the UK, there are similar things, right? In the popular imagination, going to university tends to be much more Russell Group in the imagination than anything else, despite the lived experience. So I think that that imaginary does a lot of work in putting up those barriers.
And it's not even the Russell Group; it's a subset of the Russell Group.
Sure, yeah.
If you think about going to UCL, for example, it's a great modern university, but the sort of the way that we think in terms of it is completely sort of we think of that, what you were describing, as being much more romantic than going to modern buildings and things like that.
Right. But it has a political impact, right? Because the people who are making political decisions about what happens at university have these stereotypes, and they're legislating for the stereotype. They're not legislating for the reality. I mean, this is happening to a distressing degree in my country, in Florida, where we have conservative politicians who are legislating against a stereotype of the predatory liberal professor who's going to victimize all of their students with their predatory liberal, whatever. And they're legislating against this and victimizing people because of these stereotypes. I think it's an extreme example that, again, reveals the extent to which the research that we do in the sector cannot be separated from political agendas.
And I think that, okay, so we've just basically written our next research proposal, right?
Oh my God, nobody's going to fund that. Nobody. So this is the thing. Nobody wants to hear about, and maybe you get a different response as a white man, but anytime I point out things that are political or ethical, or maybe we should think about the people who are not white guys, I get eye rolls, and I get, oh, you're being dramatic, or gosh, maybe we could talk about that later.
Yeah, no, and
do people smile and nod when Professor Lawrie Phipps says we should really think about this?
No, when I talk about things like that, because I'm talking about that in the context of a whole bunch of people that are involved in tech and educational technology, I get the same eye rolls, but for different reasons. It's like, oh, can't we just talk about the code? Oh, can't we just build something?
Yeah.
So it's hard. Donna, we've spoken for over an hour.
Oh no. Okay. Somebody else should talk.
See, I told you don't need me to intervene. You just keep debating.
Well, no. So like,
we haven't talked about our research really. Our research is basically around what people do and how they behave with tech.
We've been doing, in fairness, we've been doing a lot of interview-based stuff because we are in the time that we're in, right? And my preference would have been to have done more sort of contextual inquiry. You go into the spaces where people are. I guess there's an argument to be made that Zoom was a space where people were over the pandemic. So us doing interviews on video conferences was the space they were in. I think there's, so my experience in trying to publish some of the stuff that we've done is that there isn't a lot of appetite in the journals for what does this look like on the ground? What did this look like on the ground during the pandemic? I have been explicitly told by more than one journal editor, we don't want to talk about what happened during COVID anymore. That's old.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the most useful things that any of my anthropology professors ever taught me was every single thing we publish is obsolete.
Yeah.
By the time you get it in print, of course it's in the past. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. That just means that, you know, the drive for currency is something that gets in the way of having more representative stuff in the publication record.
And actually, I'm going to push back on that and actually just call it out as a lie anyway, because if publishers and, you know, journal editors really cared about stuff to be current, there wouldn't be a 2 or 3 year waiting time to actually get from paper submitted to paper published.
Yeah.
Right? Let's be really honest about this. When they say, oh, well, you know, is it current? What they're really saying is, oh, I didn't want this one to be published. I want to publish something else. Or, oh, I'm not particularly interested in that. Or, oh, I don't want to talk about the pandemic anymore. I'm sick of talking about the pandemic. Be honest.
I mean, me too, but
you know, but you know, don't tell me that it's a currency thing when you've got a 2 or 3 year publishing wait.
Yeah.
You know, we know the publishing system's broken. I mean, yes, it's not as bad for those of us that are publishing in education or educational technology journals, but it's still pretty bad because there's not a whole lot of them out there.
Well, and it's a labor problem, right? Where the journals are asking for free labor. Not everybody has time to review. Like, there are actual things in the way, but I think you would think that given that it takes time to review things, given that it takes time to get stuff in print, that there wouldn't be, oh, is it current? As one of the criteria for publication.
The last paper that you and I published with Jasmine, one of the problems about getting it published was that they couldn't actually find somebody to review. They couldn't find a second reviewer.
Yeah.
And that's a problem that we seem to have in this field. You know, in some subjects, that is not a problem. In this field, I think that we don't build it into people's practice enough time to take part in scholarly activities that are part of your job but aren't seen as part of your job.
So I think this is another thing about research in the sector, right? Not everybody has research as a part of their job description, right? So if we're talking about how do you integrate research into your practice, how, you know, to what extent is that something that you can engage in if your job is to operationalize tech stuff, right? How do you engage with the research? And this again was something that my colleagues in the library also struggled with. You know, I can't do research or something, but how do you at least keep in touch with what's happening? And how does that become part of the work that you do? And I think, again, collaboration is a big part of this, right? Even if you yourself are not doing research, you might have somebody in your network who is doing it, or you might be able to offer some review time to a journal and just, you know, be able to block out that time in your schedule for this is when I read journal articles or something.
Offer time too.
Well, I mean,
so here's the thing, right? Here's what really annoys the hell out of me is when we see job adverts for people to work in the educational technology field in the area, and the job adverts will say say things like, oh, you are current in in developments, you know about such and such, you'll be aware of all of the latest developments. Where do people think these latest developments are talked about? Do they think they come on the BBC News or something? They come from journals and from people's research. If you're going to employ somebody to work in this field and then tell them not to engage in the research and not to engage in scholarly practice, then don't put it in your job application that you want them to be current.
Yeah.
Live what you're actually telling people to do. And if you want people to sort of be scholarly and evidence-based and do the work, then put it in the damn job description and then put it in, build in the time for them to be able to do that.
I will give a shout out here to my colleagues at Munster Technological University who have brought me in as a senior research fellow. And one of my jobs is to facilitate a shut up and read group. And so every couple of weeks we get together, we have a Zotero group where we pick articles, we mark it up in Zotero, and then we get online and for about an hour and a half, we talk about the articles that we chose. Yeah. And so I was brought in deliberately to facilitate and protect that time for people, many of whose job is this very sort of operationalized, make X work, have a chance to dive deeply into a piece of the literature on a regular basis. And I don't know how widespread that is, but it's definitely been something that folks on the team have appreciated and that didn't exist before. They were on their own.
Yeah. We've got 15 minutes left and we started.
We're still talking. We were going to stop and then we started talking again. So would anybody else like to say anything?
Feel free to keep talking. It's absolutely fine. I think you're enjoying it.
Well, there's a lot of people in the room. We've said a bunch of stuff. Surely somebody has a reaction.
Shall we open it up to the floor for comments and Q&As, and then we can,
Yeah.
I just wanted to. I'm gonna be greedy as a host. I've got first dibs, right? I shouldn't, but I do. I just wanted to kind of follow up on what you said about the EdTech people not given time to do scholarly activities, and there's a catch-22. I totally agree, but I don't know if it's a problem just only in the UK or is in the US as well, that your contract type has a lot to do with it. So I was always on a professional services contract, which means whatever scholarly activity you do is in your own time. With my current job, I'm 2 months into my job, I'm now on an academic contract. And I don't actually know what that means other than my boss keeps saying to me, if you want to have a study leave, go and do it. If you want to go and do some research, go and do it. If you want to, I'm like, can I? But I haven't changed in terms of what I do. I'm still not teaching in a lecture theatre. I'm still not supervising students. My job hasn't changed, but my contract has. And all of a sudden, I've got this super duper power. I can do whatever I'm not going to say that word, I want. So I don't know. What do you think of that? I mean, it's not, I don't think it's fair.
It's not, I also don't think that it's universal either. I know academics on contracts that, that don't have time to do things, that are, not given scholarly time, but expected to do it, as well as academic support staff who have the same thing. I think it depends very much on the culture. I was going to say of the institution. I don't even think it's the culture of the institution. I think it's the culture of small departments and small teams even. It can depend on a whole load of things.
It doesn't have to be universal for it to be meaningful, though. I mean, this is a division that I witnessed in libraries from the very beginning. There are some libraries in the States where the people who work in the library are on academic contracts.
Yeah.
And get the kind of flexibility that you would get from an academic contract. And that includes research time and expectations, some sort of scholarly something. And then there are people who work in libraries who are on professional staff contracts, right? And those don't necessarily include those sorts of things. I think John, that there's work to be done around staff having flexibility and faculty having flexibility, but yeah.
John's actually said in the chat there that he's trying to change that culture. He's given his staff half a day for research and writing, which he said is the most he's allowed to do, probably under the university regulations. But I think a lot of this is about explicitly giving permission as well.
Mm-hmm.
Actually saying it out loud yeah, I want you to, because I know people that will sit at their desk reading a paper and think, oh, I should read this paper. I don't mean like a newspaper, I mean a paper. And they'll say things like, oh, well, I'll wait till I'm traveling home, or I'll read it this evening in the car. Actually sitting at a desk and reading a paper is actually really important for somebody to do. And giving them and saying, you can take half a day to sort of do that work is a really good thing to do. I think the only thing that I would say to John, and he's probably doing this already, is that you also have to model that yourself, and your staff need to see you taking the time for your own research, because they will, you know, your staff will model the behaviors that they see in you. If they see you doing the research and taking a scholarly approach, they'll take a scholarly approach. And I think that that's a key thing about leading in this field, is that you have to model the behaviors you want to see in others.
It actually came out of that, to be honest. The fact that I also needed some time to write my confirmation documents and get ready to write my thesis. So.
Yeah. Right. And then to Steve's point about workload models, it's interesting, Steve, that you say people on academic contracts have a workload model, but maybe professional services less so. And in my experience in the States, it's exactly the opposite. People on academic contracts, because it's flexible, they work all the time. And people who are on staff contracts, it's much more sort of limited in 9 to 5, and this is when I'm working and this is when I'm not working. But is that what you meant, Steve, or was it something else?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of discussion of workload models here, and in particular how they offer very little preparation time for the activities that take place, like teaching. And I just wonder if they're more constraining. I think here, certainly in the UK, it's less common to have one if you're in professional services. That can be good because you have some flexibility. It also could be, you know, a downside because there is no limits to how much you could take on.
Yeah, I think when it comes to workload models, and I say this coming from the US, where we have a very, very crappy landscape around labor rights and union presence. I'm in North Carolina, which is one of those right to work states, which means that it's very difficult to unionize. You can join a union, but like there are institutional barriers against it being effective. So I think that some of the stuff around workload and definition and protecting time, and I think that is, there's union work to do, like there's labor rights work to do around that, about the right to flexibility and the right to being able to have these sorts of things. We can't university our way out of that stuff, like it, and even if we do it internally, there's a sector-wide need for labor protections that is not entirely disappeared in the US. I think we're starting to see some resurgence of labor union power in the US, thanks to a variety of different forces. But yeah, I think the strike action in the UK is evidence that you all have a lot more access to labor union
we
resources.
We have access. We don't know how to actually see change.
I mean, anybody who's confused about why US academics are obsessed with tenure, the answer is that it's the only labor protection that US academics have.
Yeah.
So
okay.
On that note.
Can I ask you a question, Lawrie? Because no offense, but you're old enough to probably be able to answer that. Is the tenure model in the UK, who got rid of it? Because it used to be a thing in the UK as well, isn't it?
I'm looking around at people that can answer that better than me in the room.
Sorry to pick on you, but you are the
no, pick on him. Pick on the old guy.
I don't know. Steve, what does it look like at UCL? You've been there for 150 years, haven't you?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up. I think a lot of universities will have some clause in their statutes or something like that relates to this. And I'll put a link in the chat. This is the kind of thing we have.
Yeah.
It's Statute 18, it's called at UCL, but it's around the kind of rights of academic contracts.
I mean, that's Brett, I love that, Brett.
Nice.
I think so in the US, there are a lot less protections generally for labor for labor laws, and generally people get less annual leave, less sick leave, less of everything, and they pay for healthcare.
Yeah.
And when we were in the European Union, we had lots of labor rights and job protections that are slowly being eroded in the UK. So expect it to get worse before it gets better, because in the EU, academic contracts are probably a lot better than we have at the moment.
Yeah.
That's only going to get worse.
So this is going to be another argument then for the need for us to collaborate if we want to preserve research as a part of our practices, right? Us thinking that we're going to be able to do this in our own time is going to be eroded more and more by these political forces. And, in the same way that collective action is the way to try to remedy some of the problems with work conditions, collective action is going to be one of the ways that we can protect and preserve the time and the capacity for us to reflect and think about and do the kind of work that we need to do to gain insight, which I think is the fundamental purpose of research. The anthropological thing that I center myself on is that we're not doing this to solve problems, although at some point it might be useful. We're doing this to gain understanding and insight. And if you haven't done that work, it's going to be very, very hard to do any of the other stuff that you want to do.
Cool. Does anybody want to ask anything else that we've talked about?
Some people have already had to leave because they've got stuff to do, and that's fine.
Or we've just worn them out.
I know. We should thank people for being so patient.
Thank you. I'm not even sure that we fulfilled the brief.
Yeah, I don't know. Did we do what you said we were going to do?
Well, like I said at the beginning, the whole idea of the series is about a people. So you could talk about whatever you wanted to, and you did just that. So it's
a dangerous brief.
I mean, if you wanted to have a lecture from you guys, there's plenty on various channels that we could just watch a recording, right?
I guess we could have talked about specifics of our research. We're still doing work in digital leadership. We're still doing work in digital transformation. We're still doing, I think the last thing that we published was a book chapter on digital transformation, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it was still, those things make it sound so vague. It was still very much about people reflecting on their own practice, right? What do they do? And I think that any of the questions that any of us have in the sector around students doing X or academics doing Y, if we can center it around to what are people doing and what are their motivations for doing that, I think that there's a lot that we can get from that.
I think the one thing I would like to say about the research that we do, I've just realized that after talking about that chapter and an argument that we had when we were publishing that chapter, is one of the things that I've really changed in my practice since the start is I tell a lot more stories about the people than I did at the beginning. And I remember we actually included three stories in the latest chapter we did to illustrate those points. And I think people engage more with stories than they do with facts and figures. And I think that that's the one thing I'm trying to do more with my work now, is actually tell things as a story and build a compelling narrative around them rather than sort of just giving people facts and figures.
I like a fact-based story, in fairness.
Well, after years,
but it's how you present the facts, isn't it?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Points, and you can,
to
commentary alongside with that, right?
Yeah, to take it back to folklore, right? I am a fan of narratives. Like I'm not going to object to that. But there are stories, and then there are stories, and I think one of the things that we would advocate for is people telling stories that are well grounded and that have a substance to them that emerges from what people are really doing, and not what we assume people are doing or not what we hope people are doing, but what is there.
I'm going to ask one question. Initially, I'll let people, because I can ask you guys these questions later on in a private conversation. Anyone wants to, because I don't want to be too greedy.
Nobody wants to say anything.
You need to let them talk.
I'm going to count to 5. No, if nobody wants to do that, then I'm going to ask this question.
It's almost 11.
2, 3, 5. Yes, I did skip 4. I'm not. Actually, it might be a loaded question. So it's kind of goes back to facts and fictions, or facts and stories. And you guys were saying about when you interview people in research, they would kind of say, "Well, am I telling you what you want to hear?" You know, it happens. I think it happens to every single one of us. So I guess my question for you is, how factual can a research study be? Can your research study be? Is that like, do you? No, I'm trying to ask.
So you're asking about objectivity and rigor. Is that what you're asking about?
No, kinda. It's, I think it's objectivity versus subjectivity. What's the balance?
No, it's about
representativeness.
And this is about, in terms of research methods, this is about triangulation. This is about revisiting and connecting the data that you collect, right? So when you interview someone and they say, this is a thing, you take them at face value and say, okay, these people said this is a thing. And then you interview more people and you start to elicit patterns, right? So any of the stuff in terms of qualitative research that we're doing is about patterns of behavior and getting to a representation of a holistic. And we're not going to get all of it because we can't ever do it, but we can get towards it.
But it's a yes and.
Yeah.
And the thing, I think we work together quite well because we are not the same person. You know, we are not clones, and we have got a very different perspective on things. And yes, some people think that we're arguing about stuff when we're sort of doing that. But what it does is, from those discussions, it actually generates a perspective that is probably more objective, because it's triangulation. Okay,
yeah.
But that's what we do. The fear for me, and the thing I fear most of all when I'm working, is working alone. If I work in isolation, I second guess myself all of the time.
And it's just not as good. Anything I write by myself isn't as good as the stuff that I co-author or that I do.
I mean, we write together, but we write together on that. We've got our own site that we write together on, but we also write together, even if we're writing on our own. And I think that's important, to have somebody sense check. In fact, there's a group of 5 of us that we've been sharing stuff to read today, that you're writing, and it's just important to do that, to get a perspective. I think it's really weird that we ask people to do a PhD and go off and formulate it and think all on their own and come up with a piece of work that is purely them. It's such high risk and such, high stakes. To not involve other people in that seems insane to me, because actually I want that perspective. I'd love to see somebody do a collaborative PhD. Here's a group of 5 people. They're all getting the PhD because they did this work together, and it's pretty bloody good.
I think it was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions that we had. Someone actually did that, not at Lancaster. So 2 people from very different disciplines, and they were asked to do the same PhD project together, and they still have to write their own thesis, because you can't get a collaborative PhD certificate. I don't know how that's going to work, but they were kind of writing similarly but also very differently. That was really fascinating. I just thought I'll mention that.
Very cool.
Well, David Baum did a PhD by publication. For those of you who know David Baum, he's been around a very long time. He did his PhD by publication, and a lot of the papers that he used in his PhD by publication were collaborative papers. And I think that speaks a lot to that mindset of PhD by publication, that actually that's one of the ways that you can do it without being in isolation.
Okay, you have to stop talking because it's 11 o'clock and people have to go places. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.